In Bitter Creek Valley, the name Jacob Kane was once just another word for ghost. They spoke of him in whispers, a man hollowed out by grief, living alone on a ranch haunted by memory. But legends aren't born from silence. They are forged in a single moment of choice. For Jacob, that moment arrived with a storm, a knock on his door, and a decision that would echo through the valley for generations. This is the story of how a man who had already died once, learned how to live again. The knock came, hard and decisive, tearing through the silence that had reigned in the house for a decade. Jacob Kane froze in the middle of the room, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle mounted above the hearth. His heart, long accustomed to the slow rhythm of grief, now hammered against his ribs. His door never received visitors. Not since Abigail was laid to rest beneath the hill, and not since the letter bearing news of Matthew's death lay unopened in its old wooden box. His world had shrunk to the sound of the wind and the groan of the floorboards. Outside, the storm howled, as if the sky itself were in a rage. The knock came a second time, just as patient and rhythmic as the first. It wasn't the sound of aggression, but of purpose. Jacob pulled his hand back from the rifle. Curiosity, a feeling he thought he'd buried years ago, stirred and won out over his fear. He walked to the door that had welcomed no one for years and pulled back the heavy bolt. The night and the rain rushed in. And in the doorway, framed by a flicker of lightning on the horizon, stood them. 10 men, tall and silent as mountains. Their blankets were soaked, but they stood straight, unwavering. Behind them, their horses breathed steam into the cold air. The one in the lead took a step forward. He was old, his face a map of wind, sun, and war. His eyes were deep, and they met Jacob's without flinching or fear. After a silence that seemed to last an eternity, he spoke in slow, careful English. "We," he said, his voice as low as distant thunder, "ask for shelter. Until the storm passes." Jacob did not answer. The lamp in his hand trembled, casting dancing shadows on the stranger's face. The silence between them was thicker than the night, not a silence of fear, but of history, of blood, and land, and memory. The leader did not repeat his request. He simply waited. Jacob looked out, past the figures, into the fury of the sky. He knew the smell of this storm. It smelled like loss. He exhaled a long breath through his nose, a cloud of white in the cold air. And then, he took a step back, out of the threshold. "The barn will keep them dry," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "There's hay and a trough." They moved past him into the house, one by one. They did not move like soldiers, but like a river flowing around a stone, silent and with a purpose of its own. They brought the scent of rain and wet earth and wood smoke in with them, filling the empty spaces of the house with a presence it had not known for a very long time. They shed their soaked outer blankets without a word, laying them neatly near the hearth. They gathered around the fire, not crowding it, but sharing its warmth with a quiet, disciplined grace. One man began to mend a tear in a moccasin. Another simply closed his eyes, his breathing slow and even, as if he were listening to the heartbeat of the house itself. For the first time in years, the silence in Jacob's home was not his own. It was a shared thing, heavy with unspoken histories, but not empty. He moved to the stove, his actions stiff from disuse. He ground the last of his coffee beans and put a pot on to boil. It was a small gesture, but it felt momentous. He poured the first cup and handed it to the old chief, who had not moved from his spot by the fire. The old man took the cup, his calloused fingers brushing Jacob's. He gave a low grunt, a sound that was not quite "thanks," but was instead a deep and simple acknowledgement. Jacob sat back down at his own table, watching them. These were not the men from the stories told in town. They were carved from a different kind of reality, one of hardship and dignity. An hour passed, marked only by the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the last rains against the roof. Then, one of the younger men, a boy really, with eyes that had not yet hardened, glanced towards the mantelpiece. Towards the photograph of Matthew. He pointed a single finger. In halting English, he asked, "Your son?" Jacob gave a single, slow nod. Gone? The boy asked, his voice soft. Jacob nodded again. The war. The boy looked down at the floor for a long moment. Then, he reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, smooth object. He placed it gently on the table in front of Jacob. It was a bird, carved from dark, smooth river stone, no bigger than a man's thumb. It fit perfectly in the palm of a hand. The boy said nothing more. He simply returned to his place by the fire. Jacob stared at the stone bird. He didn't touch it. He didn't know how. It was a kindness he had no language for. Later, as the night deepened, a sound broke the quiet rhythm of the room. A muffled cough, quickly stifled in a man's hand. Jacob saw another of the young warriors turn away, a tremor running through his frame. It was a wet, hollow sound that Jacob recognized with a cold knot in his stomach. It was the same sound Matthew had made in his last weeks. Jacob told himself it was not his business. But his body moved before his mind could object. He lit the stove again, making a thin broth from what little he had, a handful of dried potatoes and a sliver of onion. He ladled it into a tin cup and carried it over to the young man. He offered it without ceremony. The warrior looked up, his eyes glassy with fever, and accepted it with a nod. He drank it slowly, cradling the warmth in his hands. The night wore on. The house, which had only held ghosts, now held sleeping men. And Jacob Kane sat in his kitchen, a stone bird on his table, listening to the breathing of strangers who felt less strange than the men he'd known his whole life. The dawn that followed was scrubbed clean. The air, washed by the storm, smelled of wet sage and rich earth. Patches of blue sky opened up between the retreating clouds. Jacob stood on the porch, a cup of coffee warming his hands. For the first time in years, the land before him didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a promise. The door opened softly behind him. The old chief stepped out, standing beside him. They watched the sky lighten together, sharing a silence that was now comfortable, familiar. I am called Two Bears, the chief said finally, his voice quiet. Jacob gave a small nod. Jacob Kane. Two Bears looked out over the vast plains. You are a man who lives alone. It wasn't a question. I was, Jacob answered. The old chief's eyes followed a hawk circling in the distance. The storms come quickly in this country, he said. Jacob glanced at him. And they take their time leaving. They stood there for a moment longer, two old men breathing the same morning air, understanding more than what was said. It was near noon when the sound of hoofbeats broke the peace. A single rider approached, a man sitting tall in his saddle with the rigid posture of the law. Deputy Miller reined in his horse just outside the fence, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. His eyes were small and hard. Kane, he called out, not as a greeting, but an accusation. Heard you had a fire going all night. Saw the smoke from the valley. Jacob didn't move from the porch. There was a storm. Miller's gaze swept the property, cold and assessing. It stopped on a brightly patterned blanket, left to dry on the porch rail. His fingers twitched. You sheltering his kind out here? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Jacob's silence was its own answer. Miller spat into the dirt. You're playing with fire, old man. You know what they are. You know what they've done. I know they asked for shelter, Jacob said, his voice flat. And I gave it. You owe them nothing, Miller sneered. Jacob looked at him then, his eyes as steady and gray as a winter sky. You don't get to tell me who I owe. The deputy sat there, caught in the quiet defiance of a man he thought was broken. He grunted, pulled hard on his horse's reins, and turned away. The town won't stand for this, Kane. You mark my words. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Jacob remained on the porch, the silence returning, but different now. It was charged with a new kind of danger. That afternoon, Jacob worked on mending a section of broken fence. Two of the warriors came to help. They didn't speak the same language, but they understood the language of work. A pointed finger, a passed tool, a shared nod of approval, it was enough. Later, as dusk began to settle, Two bears found him by the pasture's edge. The man from the town, the chief said. He carries hate. He carries fear, Jacob corrected softly. They stood in silence for a time, watching the cattle graze. The boy, Two Bears said, his gaze distant. Your son. The war took him? It did. The chief nodded slowly, a deep, knowing gesture. We all lose our sons. To the white man's fever. To the white man's soldiers. To the land. The land is the only one that does not lie about its reasons. Jacob turned to him, the old wound in his chest aching. I don't know how to let him go. You do not have to, Two Bears said, his voice like stone smoothed by a river. You only have to learn to let him walk beside you. Not in front of you. The words settled over Jacob, simple and heavy and true. Just before nightfall, another rider came. This one was different. Reverend Adams dismounted, his face etched with worry, and held out a sack of flour. Jacob, he began gently, as they sat on the porch. The town is stirring. Miller came back with stories. They're twisting it. Making it ugly. I figured they would. They don't understand. They're scared. And scared men do foolish things. The Reverend leaned forward. They're talking about coming out here themselves. Not to talk. Jacob looked out toward the dark hills, his face calm, but his jaw set like stone. A shadow had fallen over the ranch, colder and darker than the coming night. That night, the house held its breath. The warriors moved with a silent, focused energy. They weren't preparing for a battle in the way soldiers did. It was more like a ritual, an ancient readiness that flowed in their blood. They moved the sick warrior, whose name Jacob had learned was Little Hawk, into the cool, dark root cellar beneath the floorboards. The boy protested, his voice a hoarse whisper, but Two Bears knelt beside him. To survive is not cowardice, the old chief said, his voice soft but firm. You must live to tell the story, if we do not. Jacob watched, a tightness in his chest. He saw, just for a moment, his own son's face superimposed over the boy's. A ghost of what never came home. As dusk settled into a hard, starless night, Jacob, Two Bears, and Reverend Adams stood on the porch. An old rancher, an Apache chief, and a preacher. An unlikely trinity, waiting for the dark. They didn't hold their weapons openly. They just waited. Then, on the ridge, a single point of light appeared. Then another. And another. They came on horseback, a ragged collection of men from the valley, their faces hidden by bandanas and their courage bolstered by fear. They carried rifles, shotguns, and in their hands, they carried fire. The leader, a man Jacob recognized as a rancher from the south end of the valley, stopped his horse 20 yards from the porch. His voice, when it came, was brittle with false authority. Kane. We're here for the savages. Send them out, and we'll leave your house standing. Jacob didn't move. They're my guests. You're harboring enemies. Another man shouted from the back. I gave shelter to men in a storm. Jacob's voice was low, but it carried in the tense quiet. You've brought fire. Remind me again who the enemy is. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then a torch was thrown. It sailed through the air in a fiery arc and hit the dry wall of the barn. The old wood caught instantly, flames leaping into the night like a hungry beast awakened. Inside the barn, the horses screamed. Jacob raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the sky. A clear, sharp crack that was not an attack, but a warning. A final line drawn. The riders flinched. One of them panicked, raising his shotgun and firing blindly. The shot splintered the porch rail next to Jacob's head. And then, the warriors emerged. They flowed from the shadows at the sides of the house, not with war cries, but with a terrifying silence. Bows were drawn, the glint of a knife caught the firelight. They moved like ghosts, disarming one man, pulling another from his saddle, sending horses scattering in confusion. Reverend Adams fired his hunting rifle once, his aim steady, and another torch was extinguished in the dirt. The chaos was brief. The mob, which had ridden in on a wave of self-righteous fury, broke apart against the disciplined, unyielding defense. They had come expecting to fight a single, crazy old man. They found something else entirely. Something ancient and unbreakable. One man cried out, "This ain't right," and turned his horse, fleeing into the darkness. The others followed, their bravado gone, leaving their torches scattered on the ground like fallen, angry stars. When it was over, 2 men lay on the ground, groaning, their weapons gone. The rest had vanished. The barn was now half engulfed in flames. But the warriors were already moving, pulling the terrified horses free as Jacob and the Reverend ran for buckets of water from the well. Jacob leaned against the porch post, his breath coming hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. His shoulder ached where a piece of splintered wood had struck him, tearing his shirt. 2 bears walked to his side, wiping his blade clean on a piece of leather before sheathing it. He looked out into the darkness where the riders had fled. "They will not return," he said. It was not a guess. It was a fact. They fought the fire together, a silent, desperate team. They passed buckets of water from the well in a steady rhythm, the warriors moving with an efficiency that made every drop count. The flames hissed and spat, clinging to the old wood, but slowly, stubbornly, they were beaten back into smoke and glowing embers. By the time the last flame died, the eastern sky was beginning to pale. The barn was a blackened skeleton, but it was still standing. The house was untouched. They did not speak of the 2 men from the valley who lay huddled in the dirt. Reverend Adams tended to their wounds with a quiet compassion, cleaning and binding them with strips of cloth Jacob provided. When they were able to stand, they were sent away on foot, their heads bowed in shame. There was no malice in the act, only a quiet, final judgment. As the sun broke over the horizon, its light illuminating the smoke that still hung in the air, the warriors saddled their horses. Little Hawk, the boy who had arrived shivering with fever, now stood tall, his eyes clear. He approached Jacob, his movements still frail, but resolute. He held out a small folded piece of deerskin. "My mother made this," he said, his voice stronger now. "For safe travels." Jacob looked at the boy, then at the offering. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out the smooth, dark stone bird. He pressed it into the boy's hand. "A fair trade," Jacob said. The boy clutched the stone and gave a single, deep nod before mounting his horse. Then, 2 bears stood before him. In his hand, he held a piece of dark wood, carved into the shape of a hawk in full flight. The detail was breathtaking. "This is for you," the old chief said, placing it in Jacob's palm. "To remind you that even a man with deep roots can remember the sky." Jacob took the carving. Words felt too small and clumsy for the moment, so he said nothing. He simply met the old man's gaze. It was enough. He stood by the fence line and watched them ride away. 10 figures against the rising sun, growing smaller and smaller until they were absorbed back into the vastness of the land from which they came. He stood there long after they were gone, the wooden hawk warm in his hand. Reverend Adams came to stand beside him, looking out at the road. "You're a different man than you were 3 days ago, Jacob." Jacob didn't take his eyes off the horizon. "I suppose I am. What will you do now?" the preacher asked. Jacob finally looked down at the splintered porch and the scorched earth. He drew a long, slow breath of the clean morning air. "Fix the barn," he said. "Cut new posts. Maybe plant a garden." The Reverend smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "Seems fitting," he said. Jacob nodded, a faint smile touching his own lips for the first time in a decade. "Maybe this time," he said softly, "it'll grow." That night, Jacob sat by his hearth, the fire burning low and steady. The house was quiet again, but the silence no longer ached. It was peaceful, filled with the echoes of the last few days. In one hand, he held the wooden hawk. With the other, he absently stroked an old shawl of Abigail's that he had draped over his chair. He wasn't looking for ghosts in the flames anymore. He was just remembering what it felt like to be full of breath, and full of purpose. He finally spoke, not to the fire or to the memory of his wife, but to the quiet, listening air of the home he had reclaimed. I was wrong, he said, his own voice startling him for a moment. It wasn't the silence that kept me safe. It was the silence that kept me alone. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, as if in agreement. The next morning, he left the front door open. If you were to pass by the old Kane ranch in the years that followed, you would have seen the barn, rebuilt stronger than before. You would have seen a flourishing garden near the porch, full of tomatoes and squash. And you might have noticed a small circle of 10 river stones, placed just beyond the fence line. Not as graves, but as markers. A quiet reminder that a home can house many souls, and that true strength can arrive on the wind, wearing braids and carrying its own history. Jacob Kane never remarried. But he lived out the rest of his days with his windows open and his hearth warm. They say he always had a spare plate for any traveler who found themselves on his road, lost or weary. He became a fixture of the valley, a man of few words, but whose quiet presence spoke volumes. And if you were to ask old Reverend Adams about him, he would get a faraway look in his eyes and smile. He'd tell you that Jacob Kane finally learned that a man isn't made whole by the absence of pain, but by the presence of understanding. So if you have ghosts of your own, let them ride in. Let them sit by your fire. Let the silence break. Because sometimes, salvation doesn't come in a thunderclap from heaven. Sometimes, it knocks, quietly and patiently, on your door, and simply waits for you to open it.